Hi everybody, good morning. I'm David Busch and this is Busch History. I'm continuing my analysis of American history. It's an overview course for sure, and we're up to the Civil War. And certainly there's nothing civil about war, but a little background. I often have this discussion in class whether the Civil War was inevitable. And if it was, and the seeds of the Civil War occurred all the way back with the Declaration of Independence and shortly thereafter with the Constitutional Convention and the writing of the Constitution. Remember, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are not in line with each other. They are competing documents. The Declaration of Independence is all about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and freedom of the individual. And the Constitution is a framework for government with regulations and procedures that seeks to limit the freedoms, specifically limits freedoms of the states as opposed to the individual, but nevertheless limiting freedoms of the states with control to a strong central government. So what we're going to have here is, as we head towards the Civil War, is a debate between who has more power. Is it the states or the federal government? And the number one issue behind that is going to be control of property known as slaves, because remember, in the original Constitution, slaves are considered as 3/5 of an individual, and if you're not a whole individual, you can't be considered as an individual, and they were property. And the point there becomes, well, what can states do with their property? And that's going to be the march along towards the Civil War. So while slavery was not the only cause of the Civil War, it certainly was at the linchpin, if you like. It certainly was what everything was hanging on. So let's take a look here. What we have is the Civil War is fought from 1861 to 1865. It's 4 years, bloodiest war in American history for sure, because everyone that died were Americans. We like to compare combat deaths, and I will later on in this presentation, but you have to realize that everyone that dies in the Civil War is an American citizen. There are probably some exceptions to that, but nevertheless, all the soldiers are Americans. I'm not going to look at battle after battle after battle. This is more of an overview, where we came from, what happens, why it happens, why the North is victorious, and ultimately where we're going to find ourselves at the end of the Civil War. So let's get started with a little background here. Key background events. We're going to go all the way back to the 3/5 Compromise in 1787. The 3/5 Compromise makes it advantageous for the southern states to want to increase their slave population. They've already won on the point of, we're going to count slavery towards representation in Congress. 3/5 albeit, but we're still going to count slaves. So it benefits the South to increase the amount of slaves that they have, because that ultimately will increase their representation. So there's a mindset here. We can control Congress if we increase the amount of slaves and slave states. So that's going to be the first issue we're going to deal with. Then moving along, we have the Missouri Compromise in 1820, which is the first idea behind this. Well, Missouri wants to enter as a slave state, and if it enters as a slave state, we're going to have an increase in slave representation in Congress. So get a compromise. The compromise is Maine will enter as a free state, and the status quo will continue for a while longer. Moving along, in 1848, we have the Mexican Cession. The Mexican Cession, all the land that was gained as a result of the Mexican War, now there has to be a decision, will it be slave or free? We'll have the Wilmot Proviso in this. We'll have the whole idea of a divided California, which never really gains much traction, and ultimately it's going to lead to the Compromise of 1850 as a result of the gold rush and everyone stampeding into California because of gold. That will lead directly to the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850, arguably the most heinous part of the Compromise of 1850, is going to be this Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act is going to make it legal to hunt down runaway slaves in any state in the Union and return them to a state of slavery. So you will have people in the North who are going to have to turn around and participate in apprehending, if you will, runaway slaves, and that is really going to be distasteful. Now slavery is spread to every state in the country. As a result of the Fugitive Slave Act, you're going to get Uncle Tom, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Uncle Tom is the closest thing we're going to get to a movie in the 1850s It's a poignant story about the destruction of families as a result of slavery. Uncle Tom being the principal character, but certainly not the only character. And the part that's sometimes lost in the explanation about the importance of Uncle Tom is it's more than a book. It's not a book initially. It is a series of weekly narratives, if you want, that are put into different magazines or periodicals around the United States. So each week there was a story about Uncle Tom and Eliza. Eliza being the female lead and Uncle Tom being the male lead in the story. And it was what happens on their road. Uncle Tom going deeper and deeper into slavery and Eliza trying to make her way to Canada and ultimately escaping. So that's going to go on week by week by week for the better part of a year, and it really sets the nation on fire in the debate about slavery. A couple of years later, we're going to have the idea of Kansas, Nebraska in 1854, and Stephen Douglas raises the idea of popular sovereignty, that the states can decide for themselves whether they'll be free or slave. Well, that's going to ignite a series of mini civil wars within Kansas primarily, as the Free Soilers and the pro-slave faction fight for control before that vote actually occurs on the state's constitution. And that's going to lead to this whole debate over political parties and sectionalism. What happens with Kansas is the Democrats are going to divide, and we're now going to have a northern party and a southern party. So sectionalism has won over party politics. And at the same time, not out of nowhere, that's not really a good point to make, but at the same time, we're going to have a new party developed. It will be the party of Lincoln in time, but the Republicans will develop in 1854. And the whole reason for the Republicans existing is to end slavery. They're an abolitionist party. So ultimately, when Lincoln gets the nomination in 1860, he will be looked at as an abolitionist, even though he technically is not an abolitionist. Moving along, as a result of Kansas, Nebraska, we'll have Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, as I just mentioned, are these wars that are going on in Kansas over whether it be slave or free. John Brown. We meet John Brown in 1856 in Powhatan, but John Brown is going to conduct a series of kind of terrorist raids in which he's going to go after slave owners. He is an ardent abolitionist. He believes he has a God-given duty to free the slaves and participate in abolition, but he's going to use all kinds of violent means. And there are going to be people who will line up on both sides of this. There are going to be people who say that it's wonderful, that what John Brown is doing is laudable, and that he has the will of God behind him. And there are going to be people, Southerners albeit, who are going to call him a terrorist. We have Sumner Brooks occurring in 1856. That is the beating of Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks over the insults to Albert Butler that occurred during the speech of crime against Kansas, and that's going to now divide the Senate because you're going to have violence in the Senate. In 1858, we're going to meet on a national level Abraham Lincoln. There's a senatorial race in Illinois, and it's going to pit Stephen Douglas, the little giant they called him, against Abraham Lincoln. And in a series of 7 town hall style debates, we're going to hear the opinions of both Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln about slavery. In these Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln issues his House Divided speech. And in his House Divided speech, he says basically that a house divided shall not stand, that the nation will not remain half free and half slave. He believes that it'll go one way or the other, and that that's actually the way it's supposed to go. The nation needs to unite on the issue. He also states that he does not think that slavery will survive, but he does not call for its extinction. He calls for it to remain where it is in the states that it already resides, and he believes in time that slavery will die out as machines and more efficient ways of producing things take over from hand labor. However, he loses in 1858 to Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas wins, and what we really get during these 7 debates is an introduction of who Abraham Lincoln is, and it sets him up for his presidential run in 1860. You have to wonder if he won during the 1858 election in Illinois if he ever runs for president. So it's interesting how these things work out. Moving along, we get to the election of 1860, and as you'll see in a few minutes, the election of 1860 is a very divided election. 4 candidates, and Abraham Lincoln wins. And as a result of him winning the election of 1860, South Carolina will begin the march to secession in December of 1860 after the Electoral College gives their electoral votes to Abraham Lincoln, and shortly after we have the secession of South Carolina, on April 12, 1861, we'll have the Battle for Fort Sumter. It's not really a battle, it's really a shelling of Fort Sumter because the fort is really unable to fire back with any kind of sustained bombardment on the batteries in Charleston. And the funny thing about it is no one is injured. We'll talk more about that. And then ultimately, we're going to have the first major battle of the Civil War at Bull Run. And that battle at Bull Run is a wake-up call to the Union. They think they're easily going to win this battle, but they don't. They actually lose the battle. So let's take a look at some more issues here and some themes. We have the whole idea of sectionalism as described, that the country is dividing over a number of political issues. One of those issues is states' rights. How much power will the states have compared to the federal government? Key amongst those states' rights are property rights, and we're talking about slavery at that point. Does the South have the right to secede? An interesting question. If state legislatures vote to secede from the Union, they no longer want their bond with the United States. Remember, we're still relatively young here. We're 80 years old. And a lot of nations haven't survived that long. So does the state have a right to secede if they write their own constitution and the people vote on it? According to Thomas Jefferson, they did. Because it's in the Declaration of Independence that when a government fails to meet the needs of the people have the right to alter or abolish it. Is it the war of northern aggression, or is it the war for southern independence? It depends on who you ask. I have taught in the northern part of the country, and I've taught in the southern part of the country to a lesser extent, and there are still some interesting feelings about that. Teaching the Civil War in the North is all right. They are right about everything they did, and the South started the war. They used Fort Sumter, and they used secession. In the South, their point of view sometimes, because it depends on who you speak to, in every case, is that they didn't want war. When they seceded, they didn't expect that the North would attack. What they expected when they seceded was that they would go their merry way and they would develop a relationship with the North, and there'd be trading and there'd be an interdependence, if you like, but they would have their own separate government. So it's very interesting when you speak to different people about this. Then you go, the preservation of the Union. When Lincoln takes office, and at the beginning of the Civil War, he believes that preserving the Union is supreme. So it's not about slavery, because remember, it's going to be 2 years into the war before Lincoln actually issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which he seeks to free the slaves. So he really wants to preserve the Union. That's an important part to understand. Lincoln is not an abolitionist. He's against slavery, don't get me wrong. But he believes the Union is more important, and that he thinks the slavery issue can be decided on the legislative level and not through war. Let's take a look at how all this looks. This is the election of 1860. If you notice the numbers real quickly, Abraham Lincoln, 1,800,000. Stephen Douglas, 1,300,000. John Breckinridge, 800,000. And John Bell, 592,000. Yes, Lincoln gets an enormous amount of electoral votes, but he gets those electoral votes because he wins the states. He wins the states that give him the majority of those electoral votes. But if you analyze this a little closer, if you take a look at the real numbers here, you take 1,388,848,000. You have 2.1 million. It's actually 2.2 million. So more people want Douglas or Breckinridge than actually want Lincoln to become president. Lincoln is known as a minority president. You have to wonder, what would have happened? I think about this a lot. What would have happened if instead of the Democrats dividing with Breckinridge and Douglas, if they had united, and if Breckinridge had run for president and Douglas as vice president, or vice versa, if Lincoln stood a chance? But it didn't go that way. The point is, Lincoln's going to become president of the United States, and most people want someone else. So at the beginning, he is not the icon that he will certainly be at the end. And now, how do the two sides compare? It's important to take a close look at this, so we're going to do that right now. This is probably going to be a little easier to see in your own when you take a look at PowerPoints, but take a look. The North has 22 million, the South has 9 million people. And of those 9 million, 3.5 million are slaves. The North has 100,000 factories, the South has 20,000 factories. The North has 21,000 railroad miles, the South has 8,000 railroad miles. The labor force in the South, in the North and the South, 1.1 million for the North, 111,000 for the South. Farm acreage, the North has 100 million more acres than the South does. Absolutely incredible. And bank deposits. The banks in the North have $207 million. The banks in the South have $47 million. So on the face of it, the North seems to have every single advantage going into the war. Well, if that's the case, why then? Why does the South win the early victories, and why does the North take 4 years to actually win the war? It comes down to one name, and that name is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was the most respected military man in the country in 1860 and 1861. And Abraham Lincoln offered Robert E. Lee command of the Union Army. And Robert E. Lee, true to his underpinnings and the way he feels about things, says, "No, I'm sorry, Mr. President, I am a Virginian first." And he declines. He declines Abraham Lincoln's offer. And because that Abraham Lincoln is going to go through a series of lesser generals before he actually comes up with a match for Robert E. Lee. So while what Robert E. Lee lacked in supplies, he had in military experience, charisma, and just flat-out battlefield smarts. And that was why he was able to win some of the early battles that he did against the Union. This is what we look like. This is the United States in 1861. We have territories out west. We have a free California and Oregon. We have free states here. We have the slave states in the southern part of the country. And here are border states that consider themselves Southerners. These were slave-holding states, but they were the border states, and they did not secede. And an interesting example of division in the country has to do with Virginia and West Virginia. Virginia debated secession for a while, and ultimately the state divided. The state divided, and we became Virginia and West Virginia. The Civil War begins. The Civil War begins on April 12, 1861. What we have, this is a map of Charleston Harbor. This is all Charleston Harbor. This is the major harbor in the southern part of the United States. It's in South Carolina, and right there is Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a federal fort that was built to protect Charleston from attacks from the Europeans, primarily the British. Well, when the southern states started to secede, it was thought wise if they took the garrison that had been in Charleston and put them in Fort Sumter, just to avoid any conflicts with the local population. So Major Robert Anderson moves his troops to Fort Sumter, and there they stay. And General P.T. Beauregard has now assumed control of the troops that are in Charleston proper. And General P.T. Beauregard, formerly a Union commander, is now a Confederate commander. And they're running out of supplies in Fort Sumter. Lincoln doesn't know what to do. To resupply Fort Sumter could be looked at as an act of northern aggression against the South, even if it was done in a peaceful fashion. Well, Lincoln decides he's going to resupply the fort. And upon notice of this, General P.T. Beauregard and Jefferson Davis said, no, we're not allowing this to happen. And what's going to happen next is going to be the shelling of Fort Sumter. But it's an interesting thing. Let's take a closer look at it. On April 12, 1861, General P.T. Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter. So here we go, shooting at Fort Sumter. Shells flew for 36 hours. Now you would think, with shells firing at Fort Sumter 36 hours from Fort Moultrie, which is over here, that they would hit the fort. But they didn't. They missed. Why were they firing all those hours and missed? Well, if you think about this, it wasn't too long before Fort Sumter that Beauregard and Anderson had been comrades. They had both been in the Union Army. Beauregard didn't want to fire on Fort Sumter. In fact, Beauregard offered Major Anderson a way out. He offered to let him leave. He offered to let him leave and evacuate the fort and give it to the Confederates. And Major Anderson said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And Beauregard said, well, okay, here it comes. And Most historians believe that this was an attempt at intimidation to get Major Anderson to surrender, and he actually did. At 2:30 p.m. on April 13th, Major Robert Anderson surrendered the fort and evacuated the next day. No one was killed during the battle. As a matter of fact, Beauregard sent over an emissary to Major Anderson and offered to help Major Anderson pack up the fort and prepare to leave. Of course, Major Anderson couldn't do that, and he refused. But it just showed that it just showed us that this war was not something anyone wanted. And this was going to be a war of former comrades fighting each other, and actually family members fighting each other. Let's take a look now at a series of key events during the Civil War. As I said, I'm not going to do battles, but I'm going to do major points and things that the war kind of turned on. So let's walk through these. We have Bull Run, Sunday, April 12, 1861. It was the first actual battle, and it was a stunning Union defeat. 25 miles from Washington, D.C., the Battle of Bull Run occurs. And the Union thought that they would quickly march over the Confederates, storm on to Richmond, and take the capital, and the war would be over. Boy, were they wrong. But they were so confident. They were so confident in this that people came out to watch the battle. There were people sitting down and they were eating chicken bones, saying, wow, look at that over there. But you see, the battle went on and on. And as the battle went on and on, the battlefield was obscured. There was smoke, it was in a valley. The battlefield was obscured, and after a while, no one could see what was happening. Well, during this long, drawn-out battle, the Confederates received reinforcements. And when they received reinforcements, the Union Army was surprised. And the Union Army, especially the group from New York, began a retreat that spread throughout the Union lines. And the Union Army went into a full-blown retreat, being chased by who else? Johnny Reb. And the Union Army's going like this, and the Confederates are changing like this. And old Gus with chicken bones going, I don't think it's supposed to be like that. And then they start running away. And what happens is, it's a stunning victory for the Confederates and a stunning loss for the Union Army. And Lincoln realized, well, this isn't going to go too well. And that is actually the first battle of the Civil War. Fort Sumter was the first altercation, but it really wasn't a battle. It was an artillery engagement, and as we said, no one was injured during it. As a result of what happened at Bull Run, General McClellan replaces General McDowell. McClellan was thought to be a better tactician and a better military mind. McClellan's problem was he was a Southerner. And he wasn't that eager to fight. He was a brilliant military man, but he was not that eager to fight the war. Then we get Antietam, and April 12th to April 16th, 1862. The battle went on and on and on, and at the end it was actually a draw. It was actually a draw, and Lincoln declared victory. He said, well, we won this battle. Not really, but nevertheless, as a result of the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln probably had been wanting to do this for a while, and I'm guessing, probably wanted to do this for a while, was looking for the right moment, and a lot of historians look at it that way. And as a result of Antietam, he wrote in the fall of 1862, he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation and formally declared it as of January 1st, 1863. The victory at Antietam led Lincoln to write the Emancipation Proclamation, which stated that henceforth, all slaves that are held in states that are in open rebellion to the Union are now free. That's a paraphrase, but just think about that. If you're a slave in a state that's in open rebellion to the Union, you're free. So who did he free? Nobody. Because the southern states aren't going to listen to that. Not only are they not going to listen to that, the slaves probably aren't going to hear about it, because how are they going to hear about it? The news isn't going to get to them. If he really wanted to free the slaves, he would have freed all the slaves, including the slaves in the border states. So then why did he issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which was essentially an executive order? It's debated. Is it a military move to give, to cause the slaves to rise up against their masters? Maybe. Is it a social move to get the abolitionists now more involved in the war because they were a little annoyed that Lincoln didn't declare the slaves free at the beginning of the war? Probably. Is it a political move? Because now the war has taken on another meaning. Now it's not just about states' rights. Now it's a humanity war. It's a war about there are people who are being kept in servitude and they have to be freed. Not really sure what it is. It didn't free any slaves, but it certainly does change the course of the war, and it anoints Lincoln as the great emancipator. It's an interesting point. 13th Amendment will actually free the slaves. You cannot change the Constitution with an executive order. Remember, three-fifths compromise here. But anyway, it did change the way people looked at the war. Then, Vicksburg, the Battle for Vicksburg, was actually a siege that went on for about 40 days. May 18th to July 4th, 1863, and it divided the Confederacy. I'll show you this on a map in a second, but basically, when Vicksburg is actually defeated after this long siege, the Union will control the Mississippi River. And people were living in their basements and in holes, and they were eating rats and dogs. It was a siege mentality. It was let's starve them out. And eventually, the Union is going to win. So Grant is appointed to lead the Union Army, and right around the same time, because history does that, we get Gettysburg. July 1st to 3rd, 1863, 165,000 fought. The total casualties, three-day battle, 51,111 people died in 3 days. That's Yankee Stadium, dead in 3 days. If you take a look at the Vietnam War from beginning to end, the beginning at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 when the French asked for help, to 1975 when Saigon actually fell. That war is 21 years. 58,000 soldiers were killed from the United States. We have one battle. 51,000 soldiers from the United States were killed. Gettysburg was unbelievable. Now it gets even better. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in the summertime. This battle was wild. It was uncontrolled. It was going all over the area we know as Gettysburg. Farms were broken into, farms were destroyed, fences were destroyed, wild pigs roaming around, and then there were 51,000 people dead on the battlefield in the summer heat. What do you think it was like? Hell. The pigs that had been freed, they were eating the dead bodies in the fields. Absolute hell. It was a major turning point for the war. It was a major turning point because it was the furthest north that Robert E. Lee had come, and that Robert E. Lee was not victorious. Gettysburg was unbelievable, and that led to the Gettysburg Address, which we'll get to shortly. So now moving forward, the image you're looking at is the only known photograph of Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address, April 19, 1863, at which he's dedicating the battlefield cemetery, the now National Cemetery, for those lost in the Battle of Gettysburg. There's a dispute as to who is Abraham Lincoln. Many people think that this is Abraham Lincoln here walking away, but there are some who believe Abraham Lincoln is not really there, but is in the crowd here. A little difficult to see. So we have Lincoln here, or we have Lincoln here. Nevertheless, it's ignited an interesting historical debate. And if you'd indulge me for a moment, I'd like to read the Gettysburg Address. I'd like you to time me as I read. I want you to see how long this speech actually is. So, let's get started from the beginning. I'm going to step out of the camera and take a look at how long this speech lasts. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. You should have approximately a minute and 30 to a minute and 40 seconds. And I hope I did Abraham Lincoln's speech justice. Of course, I'm not going to do it the way Abraham Lincoln did, nor did I try. But that's the point, that Abraham Lincoln, in issuing the Gettysburg Address, was trying to bring the nation back together. This government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish. Very important quote, Abraham Lincoln. All right, back to the rest of the presentation. Now we're going to have Shermans March. Sherman's War of Total Destruction begins shortly after Vicksburg, the first week of November to December 21st, 1864. General William T. Sherman led some 60,000 soldiers on a 285-mile march, 75 miles wide from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. He cut a bloody swath. Sherman's War of Total Destruction. Sherman wanted to show the South he could go where he wanted, when he wanted, and do what he wanted to them. He wanted them to realize that he could do anything, and he had total power. Incredible. Civilian destruction, civilian warfare. Very ugly. This was something the South hadn't even thought about, because you have two different ways of looking at something here. You have the South is fighting the way that the Europeans had fought for a very long time. This whole sense of honor, and there's things you destroy and things you don't, things you attack and things you don't. Sherman is saying, no, we're taking everything. And it's Sherman's War of Total Destruction. Still not liked in many parts of the South. Appomattox. Following a series of defeats and ultimately losing the Appomattox campaign to Grant, Lee surrendered on April 9th, 1865 to Grant. The town was Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, at the home of Wilmer McLean at 1 p.m. The surrender did not occur at the courthouse in Appomattox. People say that again and again. Oh, well, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, and people think it was a courthouse. No. You're better off simply saying Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Because if you write in an essay that Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, and you start talking about a courthouse in any way, you're going to look really foolish. So just say Appomattox. There's no courthouse here. It's the McLean family house. Wilmer McLean, at 1 p.m. 5 days later, Lincoln is shot and died on the morning of April 15th, 1865. He was 56 years old. We're not done, but I wanted to do the key events in that order. So let's go a little further. Sherman. I'd like to read this to you because it gives you an idea of Sherman's thinking. This is a surrender request, if you like, that General Sherman issued before he took Savannah. This is after the burning of Atlanta. I have already received guns that can cast heavy and destructive shots as far as the heart of your city. Also, I have for some days held and controlled every avenue by which the people and garrison of Savannah can be supplied, and I am therefore justified in demanding the surrender of the city of Savannah and its dependent forts, and shall wait a reasonable time for your answer before opening with heavy ordnance. Should you entertain the proposition, I am prepared to grant liberal terms to the inhabitants and garrison. But should I be forced to resort to assault or the slower and surer process of starvation, I shall then feel justified in resorting to the harshest measures, and shall make little effort to restrain my army, burning to avenge the national wrong which they attached to Savannah, and other large cities which have been so prominent in dragging our country into civil war. And that's from William T. Sherman, message to William J. Hardy, December 17, 1864, and that's recorded in Sherman's memoirs. Sherman was no joke. Now what happens? Sherman does take Savannah, and Hardy flees. This is a look at the eastern part of the United States and Sherman's March. I'm going to actually draw this up here so we can see it. If you take a look, this is Atlanta, right here. So Sherman's going to go from the Mississippi to Atlanta, and then from Atlanta to Savannah. This part here is actually the part that we call Sherman's March, after he burns Atlanta in the fall of 1864. We'll take a closer look at that in a second. But this is the march we're talking about. 275 miles, and they call it a bloody swath, which, you know, it's why I use red, because why not use red? So let me get this off of here now, and let's continue. By the numbers, this is a look at the numbers relating to the Civil War. How many soldiers? The North used 2,128,948 soldiers. The South, 1,082,119. Again, it's 2,182,948 for the North. The South, 1,082,119. There were twice as many Union soldiers as there were Confederate soldiers, which is a testament to the will of the Confederacy, that they could fight for 4 years with being outnumbered 2-1. Remember, they had a reason to fight. Their lifestyle was going to change. The Southern Army was fighting very much the way the American Army fought in the Revolution. They looked at the Northern Army as invaders, and the Northern Army was. The Southern Army knew the territory, they knew the environment, they had a better working knowledge of where they're fighting. The North did not. The South was fighting for a way of life. The North was not. If the North loses the Civil War, things don't change in the North. If the North wins the Civil War, things still don't change in the North. So in a lot of ways, the Southern Army, the Army of the Confederacy, is fighting the same kind of war the Americans were during the American Revolution. Except in this case, the role has changed. The Northern Army is now the British, if the Confederacy are the Revolutionaries. So it's very interesting if you examine it in that fashion. The South had a lot to lose, and that's why they fought the way they did. The war deaths. Approximately 620,000 died during the Civil War through combat, accident, starvation, and disease. A lot died because of loss of supplies or lack of supplies, and disease as well, certainly in the prisoner of war camps. To show it graphically, these are the war deaths in the Civil War on the top here. And then we go to World War II, World War I, Vietnam, Korea, kind of going on down. Remember, Vietnam, 58,209 people. Gettysburg, one battle, 51,000 people. Remember, everyone that died in the Civil War was an American. And that's why the numbers are so far over the top. You were killing countrymen back and forth. Facts about soldiers. The average age for a Union soldier was 25.8, means just under 26 years old. The numbers aren't really accurate for the Confederacy. They took people from a wide range of ages. By the end of the war, they were using boys and old men. They simply didn't have the people to draw from that the North had. How much were they paid? The Union white soldier paid $13 a month. The Union black soldier paid $7 a month. That will later be changed, but initially that's the way it goes. And Confederate soldier paid $11 a month in Confederate dollars, of which each state printed their own. So that was kind of tough. The draft. The Confederacy issued the first draft, and that was in April of 1862. But you could get out of it. You could get out of the draft if you owned 20 or more slaves. So that's great. That's great. The Southerners are fighting a war partly due to they want to keep their slaves, and that's a major part of their motivation. But the slave owners who own 20 or more slaves, they don't have to fight. Boy, it's as old as time, isn't it? The poor people fighting the rich man's war. Gets even better, because in the North, in 1863, the first Conscription Act is passed, and you could pay $350 for a substitute to fight in your place. So if you have money in the North, you're paying other people. You're doing it two ways. You're paying $350 to the United States government, and then you often paid a new immigrant's family. And who'd you pay? You paid the Irish. The Irish got off the boat, you gave them some money, and they went and they fought your war for you, and they were never seen again. African American soldiers. African American soldiers in the North, approximately 190,000. At first, these soldiers were doing manual labor. At first, they were dragging bodies off of fields. They were cleaning latrines. They were serving white soldiers. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, we started to have black regiments being formed, and 150 to 170,000 actually fought in the Union Army and Navy. In the South, the numbers are, once again, a little less accurate. It's believed there's approximately 90,000 blacks in the Confederate Army, but they served, as one would expect, primarily as servants to the standing army. They did a lot of manual labor. On 3/4/1865, that's March 4th, 1865, General Order 14 called for raising black combat regiments. But look at this. This is within a month of the ending of the war. So they're desperate now. They're desperate and they want the slaves to fight. And no one knows if that actually happened. There are no records whether those regiments actually came into being. The order exists. We have that, but we're not really sure if they actually ended up fighting. Something that often comes up is there seem to be two names for every battle. Well, that's simply because the North used the nearest geographic feature and the South used the nearest town. So a good example of that is Bull Run. The North calls it Bull Run because there was a creek named Bull Run, and it was near the town of Manassas. So two battles, same name. They are not different battles. Key government actions during the war. Governments do a lot of things. Now this is the Union government action. Yes, I'm going to go with that because that's the federal government of the United States. We're not going to worry about the Confederate government in terms of key government actions. Let's walk through this. So April 27, 1861, very controversial. Abraham Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus. There were protests against the war in Maryland, and the people that were arrested were denied their constitutional right of writ of habeas corpus, which means the charges were never formally filed in front of a judge. Very controversial for Abraham Lincoln to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, because that's basically the right for you to be charged by your accuser. August 1861, the first Confiscation Act. That really said that as we won battle after battle, and we didn't, by the way, at first, but any land and any property could be confiscated by the Union Army, including slaves. So when an area was liberated that had slaves, the slaves were confiscated, and they became called contrabands of war. And once they started fighting, they were called the contraband warriors, hence the Contraband War. In 1861, the federal government passed soldiers' pensions. So men fighting in the Civil War, they would have pensions when they got older that would last them the rest of their lives. It sounds like a nice idea. It was meant to take care of the soldier and his family. An interesting scam that developed after the war is the surviving Union soldiers who started to age would marry young women. They would marry very much younger than their age. You might have somebody in his 60s marrying someone who was 17. Now, it wasn't for anything other than to keep the pension going, but it was an interesting scam, and it was within the last 20 years that the last Civil War widow finally died. She was very old, but she was very young when she got the pension. In 1861, we get the Legal Tender Act, also known as greenbacks. It is the first formal printing on a federal scale of these green dollars that we are familiar with today. And it was simply easier to trade with them than it would be to use coin. In 1862, the Pacific Railway Act was passed. That was the idea of let's build a railway to the west coast of the United States. You'd wonder, why is Abraham Lincoln building a railroad during the Civil War? Well, he's not. The railroad's going to be built after the war, but what's going to happen is it shows that Abraham Lincoln is forward-thinking. He wants to bring the country back together, and we're still going to be developing the West. Of course, he could have sent it through the Gadsden land from the Gadsden Purchase, but he wasn't taking any chance. It was going to go along the prescribed route all the way to Sacramento. In 1862, he also passes the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act is going to be, the people who go on the railroad are going to get land. So as you went west, you were going to be given 160 acres of land if you agreed to farm it for 5 years and build a permanent structure. Again, it shows that Lincoln does not want to be just a wartime president. Unfortunately, that's the way it's going to go. But those acts, the Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act, are really going to influence westward development later on. January 1st, 1863, we get the Emancipation Proclamation. I discussed it earlier. It is more of a political, social, wartime move than it actually is to free any slaves, because the Southerners weren't paying any attention to it. In 1863, we get the first draft in the United States, and that's going to cause the New York draft riots in the summer of 1863. The draft riots get so bad that troops had to be called fresh from the Battle of Gettysburg to put those riots down in New York City, and there was gunfire in New York City as a result of it. In 1864, it becomes obvious the South is losing the war, and the Wade-Davis bill is put through Congress. The Wade-Davis bill will be the basis for radical Reconstruction, in which the South is going to be punished by the North. Lincoln does not like the Wade-Davis bill, and he says, I'm not going to use this thing. But then Lincoln is assassinated, and the Wade-Davis bill becomes the blueprint for how to treat the South. It's going to divide the South into military Reconstruction districts. It's going to put a Union general in charge of each of these districts. It's going to be a very heavy-handed, punitive approach on Reconstruction. March 13th, 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank were set up, and they were both attempts to deal with former slaves. Remember, there's going to be 3 to 4 million slaves walking around with little to no skills and certainly no money. So the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank are going to attend to their needs. They inadvertently set up segregation. It was well intended, and it probably did help, but by the same point, it was only for blacks. And being only for blacks, it was run by whites, and it was run by Southern whites for Southern blacks, and you can imagine how that was going to go. And then, finally, the 13th Amendment, passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865. Lincoln's alive for that one. Ratified on December 6, 1865. Lincoln is dead by that time. So Lincoln does not live to see the 13th Amendment actually enacted. Because remember, the states have got to ratify an amendment, and it took that long, the better part of a year, for the states to ratify the 13th Amendment. So, and now what? Lincoln was assassinated. Abraham Lincoln is shot 5 days after Lee's surrender and died on the morning of April 15, 1865. He was 56 years old. The conspiracy fueled North-South distrust, and now Reconstruction was doomed. The broad conspiracy, which I will deal with in topic 13 of the Lincoln assassination, showed that the Southerners, specific Southerners for sure, John Wilkes Booth and company, had conspired to kill Abraham Lincoln and basically take off the top of the federal government, the Union government, because they were going after not just Abraham Lincoln, they were going after a lot of top government officials, and hopefully rekindle the Civil War. So what Lincoln had wanted was a fairly kind approach to Reconstruction, a conciliatory approach. It's called Lincoln's 10% plan. So we'll take a look at that. Is going to give way to punishment for the fallen president known as radical Reconstruction. I'm going to leave this presentation here. I've got some questions and answers I want to take a look with you, and that will be the next presentation. That will be topic 12, number 2. So we'll see you shortly, and that's it from Busch History. Remember, this presentation is available at www.buschhistory.net. In the YouTube folder, it is clearly outlined on the website. See you soon. Take care. Bye.